So today I want to go over a debate on coronavirus. I've just been seeing a lot of stuff on social media about it. I think it's an interesting topic. I think it's something that I have my biases towards, or I have in terms of certain positions I have biases towards, but I still go back and forth in my head about what to think about the whole thing. Um, and there are seemingly compelling arguments on both sides. Um, I'm seeing, especially now, I'm seeing, oh crap, I forgot to pull something else up. I'm seeing stuff um, on the idea of like stopping the mandate and the idea that things shouldn't be mandated when it comes to the coronavirus. Um, and I actually just recently saw a video, which I think is interesting. I'm not going to share it on here, but you can look it up if you want to, of somebody basically like doing the math on coronavirus. And so the idea is it may have been to date or even within a 1 year span of time. Regardless, the idea was there are so many people in the world. Of those people, X number have uh, been diagnosed with having coronavirus. Of those who have been diagnosed, X have died, and I think it ended up being like 0.5% have died. In terms of uh, infection, it was something like maybe 2.5%. So pretty small numbers, right? Um, and I have a few issues with. It's like I think that's certainly something to think about. And from the beginning, my position was always. It's really funny because like I talk to people like my friends or whoever about this, and like they're like on the one hand faulting a bunch of people for being like emotional about the topic while being like very emotional about the topic, which is really strange to me. My position has always been that I self isolated and I wore masks because I understand how viruses work, and because I don't want to put I don't want to be the reason that somebody else dies. Especially if I could easily prevent that by um, staying home, which I mostly do anyway. I have like my jobs and stuff. My jobs all turned to online in the first place. It's just like seeing my friends is not as important as like say somebody who's in my family that I know is high risk and that is elderly that could die from it. Like seeing my friends and protecting that person so that they can stay alive. It's just for me, it seems like it should be pretty clear which one of those takes preference. I'm not going to take somebody else's life just so I can go barbecue, you know, especially over a year. And it's also like I could talk to and see my friends a multitude of ways. They don't usually want to interact in those ways, but it's like, hey, I didn't make that decision. I'm fine with video conferences or whatever else. Um, you know, I have people very close to me that were at risk and who were in the demographics of people who were getting really sick and also uh, potentially getting harmed, uh, having long term detrimental effects to them, which they still may have because unfortunately some of them did get it, or potentially dying. So it's just like, it's just not as important, like it's not as important that we have like the luxury of social interaction. I see those things as mostly luxuries of modern day society. And it's just to me, it's like I haven't wore one mask. Like I've almost been choked out a bunch of times, and like that sucks. Wearing a mask does not suck. I've never almost passed out on the hottest day, even running, in over 100-degree weather. I haven't almost passed out. Other people may, and other people have conditions, and I'm sympathetic to those, and I think that that's generally why when I see people without masks, I don't judge them because I don't really know what's going on with them. Some people though are being like, what's the word here? For lack of a better word, emotionally weak. Like they're being, it's like this weird double stance where like they think that people are babies for being afraid of a virus, you know. And again, if you're not in the demographic of people who is likely to die, then you should recognize that, and there really isn't that much of a reason for you to be afraid. It is in some ways for some groups comparable to the flu. In general, that's not true. But they'll on the one hand say that, but then just absolutely complain when they have to wear a mask, and it's just the funniest fucking thing to me. But so I do want to watch a video on it. So yeah, going back to that video on math, I'm gonna watch a video over a debate that was had on this. Should these mandates be in place, or should they not? But anyway, to finish out my thoughts on that video, the idea was basically that less than 1% actually die from it, and it's like, yes, that's after so many people self-isolated, after so many people wore masks, after the government mandated that they wore masks. And so the question is, we always have this hindsight bias when it comes to these things, or that's probably not the best word, but we always have these huge biases, and see, it's like and seeing the way that things are instead of the way that they could be. So the question is, how bad would it have been in the scenario where nobody self-isolated, everybody kept going, nobody wore masks? It definitely would have been worse. It's just a matter of how much worse it would have been. I think given the fact that a lot of hospitals were already strained, the vast majority of them would have been strained, which meant that a lot of people couldn't get care, which means that a lot more people would have died, and we're still dealing with we don't even know what the long-term effects are, right? So like right now, people who get it, they seem mostly okay. So a certain percentage of people who are hospitalized, I think I had just read a study that in England, 1 in 10 people who, what was it? I don't want to get this wrong, and I may be getting it backwards, so I'll have to do this within a range. Basically, within a range of 1 to 10 people end up back at the hospital for the same thing within 6 months. And then within that 1 to 10 range, it may be 1 to 10 or it may have been 1 to 3, but a certain percentage of them die. So that means that they leave the hospital actually even feeling well and being okay, and then end up dying anyway. There are studies that show that this virus messes with a bunch of different vital organs that we have, and so we're not sure what the long-term effects are. Again, my position is you can't spend too much time worrying about facts that you don't have. So it could have long-term effects in terms of it even messed with people's neurology, so it could have neurological effects. But we know that it does some of that. We don't know to what degree. So that's where we need to temper our fear and recognize that if you're young and you're healthy, the chances are you're going to be okay. In terms of the elderly or people who are at risk, that is not the case. That hasn't been the case, and those have been the people dying. It's also really interesting because a lot of people who aren't taking precautions and are at risk, also, like, the vast majority of those people are the ones that die, and their family members die. So I was looking at one list that I think was really interesting, which was, if you go look at the list of all the people who have died, all the politicians who have died on both the state and federal level, they are all Republican, every last one. Once you get to the local politicians, and also once you make it about who was hospitalized, there are some Democrats still vastly Republican, which at that point you're just like, well, I guess that's what they wanted. That's seems to be what they said they wanted. They were more interested in freedom than this. They always, and that's the other thing too, is like I have friends that talk this way, and there was a funny exchange between Bill Burr and Joe Rogan, where basically Joe Rogan was calling people who mask up or take precautions pussies, and then so Bill Burr's just like, I'm not gonna sit here and play doctor with you or act like we know what we're talking about or whatever. And then like 10 seconds later, Joe Rogan is talking about how at one point he thought he got it and was just freaking out, and then Bill Burr's just like, yeah, so like who's the pussy or whatever, you know. And it's like, I found that to be true. A lot of people who don't like take precautions, when they think they've got it, I've had this happen with a few friends, they just absolutely flipped out. Like, so they go from 0 to 100. I think that's that's again a very interesting observation to me, that occurs. Like, people say that other people are just being scared, and then when they actually think they got it, they flip out. Yeah, so, those are my overall thoughts on it. I may have expressed some of that already, but I want to watch a debate and again see how it goes. I'm looking for the reasoning components of the argument. I want to know how they're constructing their knowledge, and I will make assessments based off of that, and maybe come to some conclusions. But let's see. So here we go. This is modern day debates. I already skipped past, I think, the non-important bits.
On Aaron. We are a neutral platform, and we host debates on science, religion, and politics. So if you enjoy controversial debates, consider explain what is in their link. So the brief, if you want to go ahead and explain, what can people find in your link?
Yeah, so my name is, I introduced myself on my channel as Jay, and the channel is called The Brief. And
I just wanted to finish the thought real quick too, because the same thing when we're talking about coronavirus and the fact that people are giving numbers in order to indicate what they feel is an over exaggeration of the harm and detriment of the coronavirus. And again, these numbers are based off of situations where people did socially distance, where a certain percentage of people did wear masks, and the hospitals weren't as overwhelmed as they could have been, and so mutations occurred less, and there was just general less exposure. The more you're exposed to a virus, the sicker you're going to get. So really, the less amount of people that you come into contact with it, the less exposure you have to it, is also going to reduce the severity. So the numbers that people are giving are already kind of it's disingenuous to give those. Same thing happened again with like the ozone layer. Like, we didn't do anything about the ozone layer and it got better, and it's like, no, we did do something about the ozone layer when no one was looking. And so people use that as an example to not be concerned about climate change, ignoring the fact that things actually were done to make that not a big deal. They just didn't do it. So it's kind of like there's a meme out there or whatever that like, this is a group test, and it's like one of those group projects where you do 90% of the work, and then the people, but everybody gets an A because of certain people doing it. And it's even worse because then those people with A's are like saying like, see, I didn't have to do that much work, there was nothing to worry about, we all got A's. And it's just like, yes, like, you just because other people did do the work to get the A doesn't mean that you didn't have to do work. It just means that you were relying on the good behavior of others to be able to feel good about yourself and make the arguments that you make. But anyway, let's go to this video now.
It's been a bit of a slow start. Things can get busy at times, and we know how all that is. We start a project and then life gets busy and we have to step back from it. But my hope is to have very short, 10 minutes or less videos that go through a variety of topics that are current and take a little bit more of a contrarian view on some of those. I feel like the mainstream narrative is pretty well known, but I think people are really interested in other takes on those news stories. So that's kind of the bulk of it. I do have a Twitter handle, kind of somewhat anonymous on there. It's at Chantel underscore Rome, and that's on Twitter. It's just my way of interacting with the Twitter world a little bit more incognito, to be able to engage with people in controversial ideas. And it's something I really enjoy. I want to be able to know the truth. And if I'm wrong, then all the better, because then I know the truth then after that. So that's kind of
good.
my position, and that's what you'd find for me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much again for coming on. Aaron, if you'd like to introduce yourself as well, that would be wonderful.
Hey, my name's Aaron. I'm living in Northern California. We're in a lockdown right here. I don't have a specific channel, but I decided to come on and discuss this topic regarding how unsilly the COVID precautions are. I have a bachelor's degree, and I work in communications.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both so much for coming on. And the structure of tonight's debate is going to be 10-minute openings. Jay, you're going to actually be going first since you are the affirmative, followed up by Aaron with his 10-minute opening.
Oh, I also have to caveat, again, just because one of them gives good arguments doesn't mean that their position isn't ultimately wrong, and just because the other one may or may not give good arguments doesn't mean that their position, am I saying that right? Just because one gives a lot of good arguments doesn't mean their position isn't wrong, and just because the other one does give bad arguments, it doesn't mean that their position is wrong. This is just, you can kind of deduce if one of them is by far making worse arguments, you can usually deduce that that position in this context isn't as well supported, even though there may be a bunch of great arguments for that position out there. And then you can also make a judgment about that person's general ability to reason to some degree. And that's about as far as you get. So don't always know what to think about the topic afterward, but the idea is that if you do that a lot, you listen to a lot of people, you listen to a lot of arguments, you get a general sense of like, oh, these people know how to make arguments, and they have good arguments in favor of their position, and these people don't and don't have it. Or you can also understand it to various degrees, like, oh, they're both making really good arguments and they both seem to be able to reason very well. I think this one reasons just a little bit better than the other one, so I guess I'm a little bit on their side. Or really it looks like they're both perfectly good reasoners, and so I don't know what to think, or something like that.
Opening, we'll have about 50 minutes to an hour of open conversation, and we'll have about 30 minutes of question and answer at the end as well. So if you do have a question, be sure to put that into the super chat, and we will definitely get that to at the end of the discussion. So without further ado, Jay, if you want to start it off, the floor is yours.
Excellent, thank you. All right, I've got a lot to get through. And so again, our topic tonight, are the COVID restrictions stupid? I think so, and here's why. COVID-19 lockdown was our first experience in a full denial of freedom. Businesses forced closed, schools padlocked, church the same, theaters dead. We were told to stay home, risking fines if we leave and jail if we don't pay. We couldn't travel, we were separated from loved ones. This job is essential, that one is not. This surgery is canceled, this one isn't. You want a visitor from abroad? Forget about it. The neighboring state, only with a 2-week quarantine. This is the introduction from a book by Jeffrey Tucker called Liberty or Lockdown. Our statement today, COVID restrictions are stupid. I'm actually fairly convinced that most people think that this is true intuitively. There is an intuitive aspect to it. However, as with any information war, it is very easy to be dissuaded of this intuitive thought and convince yourself that you're not an expert or that you don't have time to fully understand the nuance of the situation. Who am I to question these things, right? This is a great and fantastic tragedy, and it is especially tragic when you consider the measured value of the restrictions, or lack thereof, pitted against the very measurable damage we have caused to virtually every level of society, especially those who can least afford it. To add to this, we had an option of implementing a targeted approach that would have done a fraction of the damage, and yet a binary choice was given, again, to invoke Mr. Tucker's book title, Liberty or Lockdown. Now, before I continue, let's be clear about the...
I am noticing some issues right off the bat. He's already made an argument, so he thinks that the lockdowns are silly, and he thinks that because they harm liberty to some degree. And so the question is, what is the relationship between that data point? Let's say we even granted, I would certainly grant it, that of course liberty was hurt to some degree, or freedom, however you want to put it, right, was in some way restricted, right? So things that restrict freedom are silly, right? And hopefully, if you're a critical thinker, you already know that there's an issue there. There are lots of things that we do to restrict freedom, right? Like, so for instance, one of the things that I'm thinking right off the top of my head is I'm not really allowed to have a fire in my backyard without a fire ring or without certain things implemented. And I can say that's silly because it's restricting my freedom, but I know that the reality is that that affects other people, and that that policy is in place for good reasons, mainly being to ensure that there's a controlled fire that doesn't get out of control and end up, say, burning my neighbor's house down, or potentially harming or killing them, or harming the local wildlife, right? So we can think of reasons why we do put restrictions on freedom and liberty, in order to preserve safety and this and that. And the fact that it restricts liberty cannot be the reason that it's silly, right? It may be about the degree of liberty. You know, when you restrict a liberty to the point where a person has no individual choice whatsoever, that becomes, I don't even think silly. I hate the phrasing of this, to be honest, already. But just wrong, right? It just becomes immoral to do after a certain degree. That, I think, is something that we can begin to agree with. But the fact that he's starting off with this, and again, maybe he starts to modify his arguments in a certain way that will make it apparent that he does mean that this is a place where there's been an overstep, and that is the actual connection between the data and the claim. I'd be fine with that. But right now, as it stands, this idea that because something restricts liberty or freedom, it is, I'm just going to say wrong, forget the word silly, is fallacious. We can think of lots of examples where we do that, and we do it for good reason. And nobody has a problem with it. Nobody says, like, oh, it's this idea that, like, I can't just build the biggest fire that I want in my backyard. It's my backyard and my freedoms, right? This kind of goes to the old, I think it's Thomas Jefferson, it may be a misquote, but the idea that the ability to swing my arm freely ends where your face begins. So where you can start to make the argument that your actions impact others, that's when it doesn't just become a conversation about freedom and your rights. Those are still involved, but we now have to consider, okay, what impact do your freedoms and rights have on other people? That's where the conversation turns once the swinging of my hand starts to in some way hit or get close to your face. Yeah.
Restrictions that I'm talking about. Mask use, mandatory, inside, outside, anyone older than 2, from the CDC directly. What?
So I have another issue here, and that is that and I don't know if there's a fallacy out there that is represented by what he's saying. And also, as far as I understood, that there were levels. Are we going to wear masks? Are we going to wear them in certain locations? Are we not going to wear them in other locations? Are we going to socially distance? What is the distance that we should have to, is it going to be 6 feet? Is it going to be 7 feet? Is it going to be 8 feet? Is it going to be 10 feet? Is it going to be 50 feet? Is it going to be 2 feet? That's not a binary. That is a full-fledged conversation about the nuances and particularities of what exactly you can, of course, reduce all those things into lockdown or not lockdown, right? But like, so for instance, maybe for some of you out there it was different, but for me, like, I could leave my home. I left my home many times. I went walking down my street. I walked outside. I went to nature plenty of times. So I wasn't locked down. Okay, there was just certain places that I could not go because they were closed down, and then in other places there were certain modifications to what I had to do to be in those places. That you can imagine a scenario in which you are actually locked down, cannot leave your home, right? And so the fact that, again, he's breaking it down into that binary is a red flag to me. It's denoting some issue. Now I want to turn these into questions just really quick, because this is not the way to have this conversation. So I may ask him if he thinks... So again, he has posited this idea that because it involves freedom and liberty, that it must be, in his words, silly, or again, I'm just going to use the word wrong. I would ask him if he thinks that there are scenarios in which we must restrict liberty or freedom in order to preserve something that is more fundamental, again, like survival or safety. Because in my head, the way that I always think about it is you can't really have... if you don't have people, you don't have freedom or liberty, because there's no people to exercise those things. So you really need the people first. So if you're killing people, if you're doing something that results in the death of people, then you don't get freedom and liberty. Those are later emergent properties that come from people living and surviving. And so I would ask him if there are situations in which he would say that it is not silly, and if it is, why does he think his argument works here and not in these other locations? And I'm sure he would start to differentiate from there, but the point is he should just drop his original argument. The idea that you're restricting liberty and freedom isn't necessarily wrong. It becomes wrong at a certain point given the particularities, which I'm sure he would get into, but that's not what he started off with. And also this idea of the dichotomy, I might ask him if he thinks that there would be a difference between not being able to leave your home, as identifying that as lockdown, and just not being able to go to certain enclosed spaces. If he thinks those are both equally the same type of lockdown. Because if they are, then there is not this dichotomy between lockdown, no lockdown. There's varying degrees of it, and unfortunately one group has just unified certain things into, all that's lockdown. Even though, again, you can leave your house, you can go out in nature, you can go to certain locations. There was never, at least I know, there was no Gestapo going to people's doors and saying, hey, you got 10 people in there, gotta get out, right? You can have people in your private home, right? You can imagine much worse scenarios and much easier scenarios. And so but again, when you politicize something, when you make it emotional, all that gets grouped into lockdown. All of that is lockdown, even though they're obviously not the same type of lockdown.
Wash your hands, use hand sanitizer every time you touch your mask. Even if you are outside by yourself, away from others, again, from the CDC, wear a mask if that's what authorities demand. No.
Now that I don't know about, the last part that he just said there, in terms of, I guess, the CDC saying wear your mask outside even if you're not around other people, that doesn't make sense to me. If that's the case, I would say that the CDC's argument would be off there. I'm not getting it from the CDC, so I can't say. But I would say this would be where he is potentially giving a good argument against a particular issuance of the CDC. If the CDC said you have to wear your mask, or we recommend you wear your mask even when you're not around people, you're not going to be around people, that doesn't make sense to me, as far as from what I understand from the virus. So I would say he would be correct in pointing out the issue and their argument. I guess, would that even be an argument? So you should wear your mask even when you're not around people? Oh, yeah, it would be. So based off of what he said, again, granting what he said is true, the CDC saying you should have to wear your mask even when you are not going to be around people. Why? Well, because the local legislation dictates it, right? So if the local legislation dictates something, then you should do it. That's also where I'm not going to agree. I can think of plenty of examples where the local law or legal authority would say you should do X, and I find X to be immoral, so I'm not going to do it. It's happened a lot throughout history, right? So an appeal to the law. So that is where I would agree with him. Again, could be a place to start to build common ground. So I can just point that out, that I would agree that if in fact the CDC said that, that I disagree with that justification for doing that certain behavior. So yeah, again, you should wear a mask even when you're not going to be around people. Why? Because the law says so. I'm not with that argument.
Social gatherings, limits on social gatherings, limit on outdoor gatherings, non-essential businesses closed, events shut down, religious institutions closed, restaurants, indoor, outdoor dining, limits on capacity, personal contact services like gyms and salons closed, the arts, theater, museum, galleries, concerts, all shut down. Travel from the CDC. Do your plans include travel by bus, train, airplane, which might make staying 6 feet apart difficult? They recommend you not make those plans. Social distancing, curfews.
Yeah, there's an issue there where he just said they recommend you not make those plans, which would also be different from telling you you cannot do that thing, right? So that is another issue there. That is something else that falsifies. And again, in terms of questions, I might bring up, okay, so you said that there was this dichotomy between, and I feel like right now I'm misrepresenting him just a little bit, so I might have to this is where I'd be taking notes, but you feel like there's this dichotomy between, open freedom and being locked down, but then you say that they recommend that you do certain things versus it being illegal. Doesn't that warrant a more nuanced understanding of something that's not just a dichotomy, but in fact there are several possible options that we could choose from as a society in terms of how we're going to respond to this virus? That seems to me to I would just ask him that question, but that does seem to me to obviously break down the dichotomy that he laid out at the beginning of his argument.
Healthcare, elective surgeries canceled, elective procedures canceled, cancer screenings, dental visits, schools closed down, college students sent home, internships shuttered, daycare centers closed down, educational outcomes affected, childhood and after-school programs of all types ended. That's what we're talking about. This is a piece briefly by the New York Times. I'm just going to quote just a very small part of it. It's also hard to tally the indirect fallout of lockdowns. A death certificate can tell us that someone died of COVID-19. It cannot tell us that the social isolation of lockdown was a factor in someone's drug overdose. There is no nightly ovation for survivors of domestic violence.
Okay, I have to go back and listen to this again. I feel like this is significant.
Mask use, mandatory, inside, outside, anyone older than 2. From the CDC directly, wash your hands, use hand sanitizer every time you touch your mask. Even if you are outside by yourself, away from others, again, from the CDC, wear a mask if that's what authorities demand.
Okay, yeah, that second part now I can see is a little bit confusing because he said, wash your hands if you touch your mask, even if you're not around others, right? And that would be different because I can imagine a scenario in which you go inside of a place and you leave that place, you haven't washed your hands. You should just wash your hands, first of all. It's just a good thing to do. But then you touch your mask. Okay, but COVID stays on your hand for a certain amount of time and you've touched your mask. So you should wash your hands because if you're a person who constantly touches your mask, which my guess is they would anticipate a lot of people would do, and so would I, because it gets hot or you want to readjust it or whatever, right? It slides down, you have to move it. It's just one of those things you have to adjust a lot. It's a good practice that if there's something that you have to touch a lot with your hands, that you touch at, this is the thing we use between this and our feet to touch the most. Actually, in terms of the variety of objects that we touch, our hands are what we use the most. So it comes into contact with the most things in this world because we're tactile, because we're we preference kind of like the digital fingers. We preference touching things with this, and there's some evolution behind that which I won't get into because it's irrelevant. But the point is, it seems to me that would be a good idea to tell people hey, you touch your mask a lot, or if you're touching your mask a lot, or you're the type of person that does that, and you're coming into contact with a lot of things you're touching, it's probably a good idea to just continue to wash your hands. But what that boils down to me is just oh no, they told people to wash their hands. How how awful is that they would do that. It's really weird to me to make that type of. I would cut some of this down. I think there's some good conversations to be had in here, and they're just being bogged down by ridiculous ideas.
No social gatherings, limits on social gatherings, limit on outdoor gatherings, non-essential businesses closed, events shut down, religious institutions closed, restaurants, indoor, outdoor dining, limits on capacity, personal contact services like gyms and salons closed, the arts, theater, museum, galleries, concerts, all shut down. Travel from the CDC. Do your plans include travel by bus, train, airplane, which might make staying 6 feet apart difficult? And
I just want to point out, like, none of this really matters if the thing that we're talking about very heavily restricts safety and survival. So the fact that he's saying any of this does not really matter in the scenario where safety and survival is prevalent. Now, if he comes back and he says, like, considering the low numbers of things, this is, how we should have done it, that's completely fine. But just on the face of it, those things don't run together. This idea that they restricted things so it was bad, right? That's going to depend on the context. And this also goes to, because there was another option here that I'd heard from some people, which I think is interesting, but it also illustrates the ignorance and the misunderstanding that a lot of people have on their own abilities to think critically about things and understand complex situations. I remember talking to a friend and them talking about, like, well, why can't we just isolate people who are at risk and who are elderly, and then so all the young, not at risk people can go free. And it's like, that is for somebody who cannot think about the logistics of a situation and the difficulty to make those logistics happen. So, like, the elderly still need care. They still need groceries. They still they still have their own rights to certain activities and this and that, right? So to have this idea in your head where there would be this perfect isolation, it's just like, what are you going to do? Round up all the obese people and put them into buildings, right? It's like, round up all the diabetics. Are you diabetic? Okay, well, come on, you're coming with us. Like, this is ridiculous, right? Which is why the CDC made general laws, because they understood that doing something like that would have been much more difficult to do. It would have been costly, right? It would have costed way much more money than just saying, hey, everybody, modify your behavior some. Like, that was just easier to do. It was less costly. And it was more likely to be effective, because, again, you can isolate diabetics, you can isolate people with cancer, you can isolate people with certain vital organ defects, isolate people who are prone to viral infections or death from viral infections. You can isolate the elderly. Who's going to give them their food? Who's going to provide them care? Who is going to provide them forms of entertainment? Like, none of that is really being thought about. It's something that is boiled down, something that people try to make easy, and from my view, for their own convenience, because they're selfish. That's something else I wanted to say too, is I noticed that a lot of people who had issues with the idea of socially distancing and wearing masks, I do make an observation that a lot of them that I know are actually selfish people, from my view. Like, they're people who are prone to drive drunk, let's say, or just generally drive recklessly. They're people who are prone to just really not consider how their actions impact other people. They're more concerned about themselves, generally speaking. And that's also where, like, me as a person, I have to make a choice, right? I'm not choosing that. I've never been the one to choose that. So I'm not doing that. In terms of, like, where I stand, it's like, I'm going to go on the side with people who seem to, like, all their actions align with this idea of considering how your actions impact other people, and taking that seriously. I align myself with that. So, yeah, let's see. I think we're gonna get into the part that I think was important. So let's see what he says here.
And they recommend you not make those plans. Social distancing, curfews, healthcare, elective surgeries canceled, elective procedures canceled, cancer screenings, dental visits, schools closed down, college students sent home, internships shuttered, daycare centers closed down, educational outcomes affected, childhood and after school programs of all types ended.
And again, any one of these may be problematic. There can be lots of nuance in here where it's just like, okay, this, like, so for instance, like cancer screenings, right? I can totally, like, you just heard me say that, like, safety and survival is important, and then we need that as a foundation for freedom. So if it became the case that if I had a reason to believe that not getting a cancer screening was going to increase your chance of death by X amount, and that X amount is obviously much higher than your chances of dying from coronavirus, I would say that's a no-go. Like, that you're right. I would totally agree with the brief, and I would say that is a place where they should have thought about the implications of the policy better. So that's just one example of how, like, what I had said before, there can be lots of things in here that are completely legitimate. It's the arguments that he's making that he seems to be saying that because any of these things happen, that it's a bad thing, as opposed to, hey, let's look at these particular instances where the CDC says that their concern is safety, right? Like, if you don't go to a play, you're probably not going to die, right? Or the ways that I can think in which you would die from not going to a play are pretty convoluted and unrealistic. Maybe you get depressed and you commit suicide, which was another thing to think about, right? And that's, again, where if he had made that argument, I'd be like, yeah, that is something we absolutely need to think about further. And maybe in this, on this issue, the CDC or the government as a whole, or what certain healthcare workers were advocating for was not the best. I could completely agree and get on board with some of the nuances of that. It's the fact that has this sweeping generalization around these just ridiculous things that certainly aren't like that restrictive, or like are an imposition of freedom in the smallest sense of the idea.
That's what we're talking about. This is a piece briefly by the New York Times. I'm just going to quote just a very small part of it. It's also hard to tally the indirect fallout of lockdowns. A death certificate can tell us that someone
the fallout of lockdowns, okay,
died of COVID-19. It cannot tell us that the social isolation of lockdown was a factor in someone's drug overdose. There is no nightly ovation for survivors of domestic violence.
Okay, yeah. So he is saying something along the lines of what I was just saying there, that we do have to consider the impact of social isolation, the impact on people's mental health that could have. And I think that that's a fair conversation. That does not mean that the lockdowns are wrong. So again, that's the issue. There's again an issue in his argument here, and that he is saying, generally speaking, the lockdowns were bad because we can't tell how many deaths resulted from the lockdowns. Notice how I said in terms of data, we can't tell. Notice how earlier, and so hopefully people will see I'm being consistent here, I had said we don't really know what long-term effects there are of COVID. So we really need to temper our fear and response based off of that. You cannot really go based off of a lack of information. You can to some degree, but you need to understand it's being based off of a lack of information. So again, the fact that he wants to rely, he's using a specific quote, my guess would be by somebody who doesn't even agree with him, that he wants to go off of a lack of information is, again, a bad sign for me that this person really is considering what his, how can he accurately build knowledge. So in terms of a question, I might turn to, does he think that we should be going based off of the potential? Does he think that the COVID deaths that we know occur should how would I phrase this? Should take preference, or yeah, does he think that the social isolation that could result ultimately in someone's death should take preference over the COVID deaths that we know occur? Or I may even use an analogy with him instead. I think that actually would be better because, again, he's already primed to think about coronavirus in a specific way. So I would ask him whether or not, I would probably go back to what I was saying before. Does he think that the potential that we should consider, or no, I'm sorry, not that we should consider, considering potential information is fine. That's the issue, is when you want to treat the information as if it already exists. So does he think that we should assume that the long-term effects of COVID are detrimental, even though the information isn't there? Potentially, it could have harmful long-term effects. Because if he says no to that, then I would ask him, okay, well then why are we doing that with the potential of deaths due to, say, suicide or drug overdose due to social isolation, or any of those things, or domestic abuse? There's really lots of things that you could do, but the point is he's basing it off of potential information as well. So why shouldn't we just assume that the coronavirus could absolutely just in 10 years give everybody who contracted it a neurological disorder akin to seizures, and that's just going to completely overwhelm our healthcare system and make it harder for everybody to live? Why don't we just assume that? Because that's not what we do, right? It's okay to consider that and be leery of it and say, okay, well, that could happen. Now let's start researching it. Let's put some money towards trying to figure out how bad that actually is, right? So really you need the research to you can assume that domestic violence is going to increase, that suicide is going to increase, but you really want to put the funds towards figuring out how much to really assess and compare it to coronavirus death and harm, by the way, not just death, but harm, and say, okay, really what we're asking here isn't worth the overall outcomes. Essentially, more people are going to be hurt by domestic abuse, more people are going to commit suicide than would ever die from the coronavirus. That's where I'd say, yeah, I mean, we need to, unfortunately people would die from coronavirus, but the other side is more people would die from something else. So, but we don't have those numbers. So again, the fact that he wants to go off of the potential there is a bad sign for me.
These tragedies have become an ambient backdrop to everyday life, present but forgotten, very real but ignored. Perhaps America has simply gotten comfortable ignoring the quiet suffering of others. It can be easier to shut our eyes to the outcomes,
I don't disagree with him,
wait for the vaccine, and try to move on. But doing so would be a mistake. This virus is not behind us. How to best mitigate its damage is a question of the present, not the past. So, now, what are we talking about? This debate's going to happen in two ways. This debate will be a debate, I hope, and I believe, of factual claims, as it should be. But then this debate should turn and maybe morph into something a bit more than just facts. It should be something much more fundamental. It should be about freedom. And I'm sure there's probably some people going, oh my, here we go. Freedom. It's got to be freedom.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's ridiculous. I would say that obviously it should be based on facts, but it should also be based it should be based on reason, right? So how does the data support certain conclusions? Again, that's where nobody wants to go. He wants to make it about freedom because he understands it's where his position is the strongest. This is without considering safety or harm to others or survival, right? These more basic things. He just wants to make it about, I think it should be about freedom. I think it should be about safety. I think it should be about liberty. I think it should be about reduction of harm, survival. I think it should be about protecting. There's millions and millions of things that you can make this about, but ultimately I think it comes to what's our reason? What are our reasons for doing one thing over another? And the fact that he wants to boil it down to this one simple concept where he knows, and I agree with him absolutely, that he has the high ground, is again, it indicates to me that he isn't really interested in a full, honest conversation. Otherwise, he would have said, it's about freedom. It's really about all these components, and we should consider them all and not just leave certain things off the table because right now we want to focus on freedom, right? That seems to be something that Americans want to do up until the point there's actual repercussions to their again. In my head, I'm thinking about friends and family that I had that they were concerned about that until they got it, and then they became the biggest complainers I have ever heard on this topic. There's a disconnect in your mind when stuff like that is happening, where it's like you don't believe in seatbelts up until you get into a really bad wreck, or you don't believe, this would actually be more important, you don't believe in baby car seats up until your baby really gets badly damaged, and now also you're about to go to jail. And now we get to see like, oh wait, like there's there are these other components like safety and the rights of the baby to survive that supersede your right to decide whether or not to buy a baby seat, to decide whether or not to set it up and to put your baby in it, right? Your freedom is not the main component in that situation, right? And in fact, I can't really think of any situations in which freedom would be the main component. I can't really think of any situations in which just one thing would be the main component. Things are nuanced and complex. I'm saying I can't think of it. I'm not saying it wouldn't be the case. I do tend to preference safety and survival. So it's like, again, if we're in a situation where you want to build a really big fire, it's like your potential to hurt other people with that fire does not trump your right to build the fire. But yeah, I see, even in that scenario, I would say both of those are conversations. So now it's like, okay, well, we're not going to say you can't build a fire, because that would be a restriction on liberty. So, okay, but what are the constraints around building the fire that are fair, that allow for the safety of others, but still allow you the liberty to build some sort of fire, even though it may not be the one exactly that you wanted, or to set off fireworks? That's another conversation that could be had, or lots of things. This is an ongoing conversation that involves a lot of topics. So the idea that he just wants to boil it down to that one thing, bad sign to me.
But for those that check out at this point, I'm sorry for your cynicism. There's a lot to be said about this idea.
And again, in terms of questions, I would bring that up. So what does he think about the right of somebody to build like a really big fire with very close neighbors by, to the point where the temperature could get so high that it would catch their house on fire, right? Because if he's going to say that, well, we have to consider their rights to exist and to, be safe, it's like, yes, okay, so you are agreeing that those are innately part of complex issues. Why do you think it's not a part of this issue? What about you is informing you that the people who die from COVID, that their rights to be safe, people who are elderly, people who have pre-existing conditions, that your rights to freedom in any situation, in all these different situations that he was just noting, that his rights trump their rights to exist and survive.
I would quote, birds born in cages think flying is an illness. Now, to my claims of fact. Step 1, what was the goal of the restrictions? Step 2, did the restrictions affect the way that we reached that goal? Step 3, what did we trade for the results that we got? So what was the goal? For survivors of domestic violence. These tragedies have become an ambient backdrop to everyday life, present but forgotten, very real but ignored. Perhaps America has simply gotten comfortable ignoring the quiet suffering of others. It can be easier to shut our eyes to the outcomes, wait for the vaccine, and try to move on. But doing so would be a mistake. This virus is not behind us. How to best mitigate its damage is a question of the present, not the past. So, now.
And that's where I agree with him, and I think he's starting to, maybe he is going to gear this. Maybe he wasn't making that list to say like, hey, you see all these places, they're taking away our freedoms, but to say these are the different areas that we need to be considering. And in that situation, I would agree, like, hey, here's all the things that happen. We need to consider each one based on how much harm they're likely to cause, and then also how much they're likely to infringe on freedom. Then I would agree with him. And that really we have to think about what's going on right now to come to the best answers.
What are we talking about? This debate's going to happen in two ways. This debate will be a debate, I hope, and I believe, of factual claims, as it should be. But then this debate should turn and maybe morph into something a bit more than just facts. It should be something much more fundamental. It should be about freedom.
And again, why it should only be about that thing. He didn't say only, but like the fact that he's highlighting that makes me feel like to him, that's really either the only or the main consideration, and I do not see why it should be. Not yet, anyway.
Sure, there's probably some people going, oh my, here we go, freedom. It's got to be freedom. But for those that check out at
it's perfectly fine to consider freedom. I don't see why it should be the only.
this point, I'm sorry for your cynicism. There's a lot to be said about this idea. I would quote, birds born in cages think flying is an illness. Now, to my claims of fact. Step 1, what was the goal of the restrictions? Step 2.
Okay, so what was the goal of the restrictions? Okay.
Did the restrictions affect the way that we reached that goal? Step 3.
Did the decisions affect the way that we reached that goal?
What did we trade for the results that we got?
What did we trade for the results that we got? And I think those are all fair points of consideration in terms of facts. I think I actually agree with him on that. I can't think of... That seems like, to me, the most intuitive... I have an intuition that those would be the most basic things that you would consider. Is, why are we... What goals do we have in implementing these things? Probably the first and the last one, really. Why are we considering these things? Why are we considering certain proposals, or what are our goals in considering certain proposals? And also, what's the trade-off? What do you gain or lose when you implement those things? I would say that's pretty fair.
So what was the goal? The old mantra, 14 months, months to flatten the curve, right? But ultimately, we're talking about overwhelming the healthcare system. And the metrics we would measure would be hospital beds, ICU beds, ventilators.
So my guess there is that he is talking about different healthcare professionals saying different things, or he is talking about how belief can change based off of new information. So he has either heard the CDC at one point say 14 days and then, okay, well, it's going to be 14 months, which isn't a problem as long as they are following what the information is rightly saying. Or he's talking about potentially different organizations saying different things. So this organization is saying 14 days based off the information they currently have, and this is saying 14 months based off of what they have, and that's going to change based off of, as he just talked about, where we're at currently. And because information changes things constantly. We're constantly updating information, and that should rightly modify the way we see things if the information is in contradiction or it provides context to what we believed before. We should just be grown-ups and put our pants on, big boy pants on, and change what we think.
Hospital capacity, that kind of thing. The prediction based off models was that this crisis would reach such levels that we would effectively exhaust our capacity and people would die in waiting rooms and in buses being turned away. So that was the goal. Whoop. Sorry, I messed up.
That seems fair.
That was cool. If it's worth noting that this goal has shifted from flatten the curve to stop the spread, which certainly seems connected, but the sentiment really relates to stopping all of transmission if possible, as opposed to keeping transmission from spinning wildly out of control. So let's look at the data. These are current numbers that I pulled.
So flatten the curve versus stopping transmission. I think if he's correct, that's fair. I don't think he's correct is the issue. I haven't heard any medical professionals say. I've definitely heard some public figures say, and I've heard people in political realms say stop the spread. I would hope, I haven't heard any, and I would hope that anybody in the medical field knows better, or anybody who understands or is familiar with the medical field or just listens to what medical professionals say would know better. the idea that we would completely stop transmission. Actually, I think New Zealand. Yeah, it's like even New Zealand. Like New Zealand, at one point, I guess they did mostly stop it. So maybe that was possible to a degree. But eventually it did. Like people started to get it again. It's a virus, so it's really hard to stop the spread. So I don't know. Maybe he is right. Maybe there are some medical professionals out there that were like, we need to. They went from saying like we need to flatten the curve to like we need to stop it, and it seems like he's trying to make some connection between the idea that really what it was about was control. It wasn't about protecting people, or it wasn't about preventing people from harm. That, you know, once they got us to a certain level of flattening it, the next natural step in terms of wanting to control people would be to say that you want to stop transmission completely, so you isolate them even further. It is also possible that it was more like, okay, we flattened the curve. Now let's try to reduce it. Let's just try to make it better. The less deaths, the better. I don't see why that also isn't an option, but it's possible that the first one is an option too.
As of today, and I was trying to get the most recent stuff. I don't have time to talk through all of them because there's too much, but I'll just hit some specific states. In Arizona, as of today, the hospital bed capacity is 90%. That's the same spot we were. Okay. About in July. So we're not much different from that point. 30% of patients are in the hospital with a positive COVID-19 test, though that is not specific. So they might be there for other reasons, but that's being reported that way. I checked, and I would imagine there would be some immediate group of headlines, but you'll have to take my word for it. I looked, there are no reports of any singular hospital being overwhelmed in Arizona, period. I looked, and I would imagine if there was a hospital that was completely inundated, that they were, bursting at the seams, it would be front page news. You would see it. Obviously, we would know this, but there are no articles. Now, there are many articles that talk about how it could be, might be, will be, in X number of days and weeks it will be. But there's that goalpost keeps getting pushed back. We don't actually see any hospitals being overwhelmed. Okay, so South Dakota, where news reports are hailing South Dakota.
Yeah, he seems to be misunderstanding like the complexity of information and how hard it can be to like reach certainty and conclusions, and how information again changes day to day. Like day to day it changes. So you can have something that, I mean, there's so many good analogies out there to think about why what's being said is ridiculous, right? It's like, and then also actually we can again incorporate the idea of safety versus freedom. Like there are certain things that you're not allowed to put in your yard or have on your house because of potential weather conditions in certain locations, and it's understood that when you do that you put other people at risk, right? But then we also understand like the precarious nature of weather. So it's a situation in which like meteorologists or other experts are coming by and they say like, yeah, it looks like stuff's about to get dicey here, and people should be preparing in the community. The community does not at all care at that point to start making preparations, only because we're talking about COVID and only because it's politicized and emotional do people seem to really care, right? But storms are also very precarious, and so it's just like whether people saying like, well, we thought this was going to happen and it didn't happen, right? The information changed. Also, experts sometimes do need to be more careful with what they say. I've absolutely heard experts or people advocating on behalf of experts. We all actually need to, not even experts, just everybody. We all need to just suck it up, and like when somebody points out something that we said is wrong, like don't become pissy, right? Like don't become a whiner about it. Just like change what you say. Just like, oh, okay, well actually I'm sorry, I meant this thing. Like it's just not that big of a deal, right? Especially if you're wrong, right? So that I would say would be one thing, is to just change the way that we view information and knowledge, and change our attitude towards being wrong and incorrect. So again, scientists also have made that issue. But there's also an issue of interpretation from the public. So, for instance, one of the things that I noted, I don't know what's going on with Arizona. I don't know why he picked Arizona. Maybe he said it and I missed it. It seems strange to me that he's just focusing on Arizona. So, like, if the CDC doesn't just give their recommendations based on Arizona. So, really, what we want to know is how many hospitals were likely to become overwhelmed and what can we do about that? Because we recognize that there's a saying, it's better to have it and not need it than it is to not have it and need it, right? So the idea is if we prepare for this thing happening and it doesn't happen, great, less people are still going to not die. So that's a good thing, but it's weird. People use that stuff like that as like a bad thing. There's a loss in income and revenue, but it's just like, okay, which one do you value more? Do you value income and revenue or life? Because if you value income and revenue, then we have to have a much more fundamental conversation about morality and empathy and all that good stuff. And then what was the other thing? Yeah, so focusing on Arizona versus other locations. Oh, yeah. Like Dr. Fauci at one point had said that I had heard, I think this was of course a conservative. Like I'm listening to conservatives and people who aren't conservatives but still don't believe in COVID. Like I'm just trying to get a range of like, where is everybody at? Where are the arguments at? How reasonable are they? How reasonable are the arguments? And how are these people demonstrating an understanding of reason? So I hear a conservative say that, and I think this was Steven Crowder, say, oh well, Texas is going to blow up in a month, right, Dr. Fauci? Because that didn't happen, right? So the idea is that Dr. Fauci said like Texas, because of the way that they're treating the coronavirus, is going to explode with cases. And so I'm like, oh yeah, if he said that and it didn't happen, Dr. Fauci needs to be more careful about what he says. He is ruining the reputation of people in his field. He needs to stop that. But I want to get it from the horse's mouth, so I go look at it. Sure enough, he said that if they don't change their behavior, there is a risk that it could happen. And if I have to explain to people the difference between the risk of something happening and saying that thing will in fact happen, that is, again, to me, just another demonstration that there's issues in reasoning, or there's issues in comprehension, one or the other, or potentially more options. But the point is, now having heard Steven Crowder, it may have been somebody else say it, I'm just now like, okay, now I trust you less. Like now I don't think you really you're not really concerned about what's fair or right here. Like you're concerned about your emotions and your ideas being validated. That's your main concern here. So I would be interested to know, he may very well be right and in fact, I would even bet money on it that at some point, of course, some health professionals did not word what they were saying properly. Generally speaking, I think they know better. But I do wonder if after hearing him say that, which happened a lot, I go and I look up what was actually said, it actually was not at all that thing. That happens a lot, which again makes me feel like I'm listening to the professionals when it comes to this, because they seem to understand how arguments work. They seem to understand how data can give us certain degrees of confidence in certain conclusions, and the people that I hear arguing against it don't. They continue to make mistake after mistake, and they don't seem to understand that. So of course I'm going to trust them less, and I'm just going to go, hey, I'm not really concerned about coronavirus, but I am going to stay inside, and I'm going to wear a mask when I go out, because it's just a mask. It's not that big of a deal, and I'm not like a baby, so like I'm just going to do that. Didn't at all get hurt, by the way, at all through this whole process of like staying inside and wearing a mask. Never hurt me, not once. I'm completely safe. Yeah.
A couple of weeks ago is the next like enormous COVID hotspot. Disregard for COVID, restrictions was certainly to blame. Led to an overwhelming situation, especially since they have a lot of rural hospitals there. But when we look at the numbers currently, South Dakota's hospital capacity, they're at 58%. And 16% of those are COVID patients. So we would assume that South Dakota's peak 2 weeks ago from now would hit the hospitals at this point, and they would be bursting at the seams. But again, we don't see that. Okay, Florida. I'm sure somebody's out there like, okay, now do Florida. Good old Florida, land of the slow news day antics, right? So Florida, where the governor's opened everything up statewide. It's crazy. It's madness. It's the Wild West down there. Okay, so the hospitals, no, not overwhelmed. If you look at a cross-county average, it shows that they all have 20% availability. For them, based on last year's numbers, not a particularly unusual number for this time of year. Again, available ICU beds are at 18.5%. And I want to take a moment to point something out too, that and this helps really bring context to this situation. In the 2017-2018 flu season, we were treating people in hospital, like in tents, in hallways. I mean, it was there was a lot of expansion of capacity into field hospitals.
So I just got a comment asking why I think this is from Juggling Lessons. I hope he's doing well. Let's see. And I guess I also want to I want to apologize for maybe the way that I say some things. Not necessarily this thing, but I did just call people babies. And I think part of that is just like hearing it from the other side and them say it. Like, I want to kind of reflect that back in hopes that people will see that they're doing the things that they're kind of pointing the finger at other people at and saying that they're being that way. Probably still not the best way to put it, but he wants to know why I think people oh, okay. Yeah. I also see what he's saying. He's saying that my level of analysis is getting too repetitive. I could absolutely see that too. Could you describe why you think that people are being emotionally weak? So the reason that I think that is because when I talk to people about this, and I've talked to numerous people about it, it gets to a point where they're emoting, like they're not really concerned. They seem to stop being concerned about what's true, or where the details do in fact lie, and whether or not the details do in fact lead to their particular conclusions. It often ends in me like just sitting there waiting for them to get done emoting, and like just me having to this happens a lot, by the way, when it comes to certain conversations. I feel like, and I also have to acknowledge that sometimes I start speaking quickly, and I think that can come off as aggressive, even though like I don't feel angry or anything. Like I'm just trying to move on to the next thought. That's just something I have to work on in terms of my pacing. But what I notice, so that could be one reason that they're responding to the way that they are. That's something that I need to work on. But a lot of times, all I can say is in terms of how I view myself in those conversations, again, maybe I need to be more self-aware in those conversations, but I am just like trying to ask questions or share facts, and it very quickly turns into them giving me 500 facts within 2 minutes, and like very aggressively, and like to the point of like quite literally like stomping their feet, right? So, and to me that's like emotional weakness, when you can't control your own emotions. I become the one that, like, at that point I won't ask them certain questions. I'll take questions off the table because I recognize that this person isn't going to respond emotionally well to me asking certain questions. That happens a lot. And I also had to just take myself out of certain scenarios. Like, for instance, I remember having a conversation about abortion, and I asked them how they defined life, and that was just too much. And so they start screaming and yelling. And it's one thing also when, like, you understand that there are emotions involved in certain topics. But it's another thing when you hear those same people talk about how emotional the other side is, which to me is an even a further demonstration of emotional weakness. That not only do they think the other side is just emotional and doesn't care about facts, but they don't recognize when, like, they're being emotional or even being threatening. I also had that happen recently when talking about coronavirus, and like the precautions that they took versus the ones that I took, and them seeing me as like just being scared, and me like being very emotional, like emotionally tempered, and okay, well, where are you getting this? Or you're saying this, but what evidence do you really have for it? And then them just like blowing up that I would even go there, right? And it's just like, you are on the one hand saying that these people are being emotional, or that the other side's being emotional, and you are demonstrating a lot of emotions. That to me is sort of, when I say emotional weakness, what I mean is an inability to recognize emotional states that you're in, and the inability to recognize how they may be impacting the way that you are reaching certain conclusions, or how they're affecting your ability to think or reason through things. I would say it would be like two things I would describe as, when I see these things, I think that's emotional weakness. So yeah, hopefully that, I think you asked it a while back. Yeah, but that is the idea. And I notice a lot of that. So not that, I guess the other side of that too is that we can all be emotionally weak sometimes. That's a natural human thing to do. I particularly, again, I don't like the idea of pointing to another group and saying like, oh, they're like snowflakery, right? Like, oh, those liberals are just being snowflakes. And then like I start to have a conversation with people who talk like this, and I can't ask them a question about a definition or something without them blowing up. It seems pretty apparent to me that they too, regardless of whether or not the liberals are being emotionally weak, or demonstrating or being a snowflake, let's say, that they are too, and that I think is emotionally weak.
And other things like that. That was during the 2017-2018 flu season. Medical staff worked overtime. I'm sure they were strained and stressed, but there were no lockdowns in regards to that. Not that it's any of my business, right? Okay, so now that being said, let's consider the most, or one of the more important aspects, timing. When were the measures enacted? And I'm going to do a screen share here in just a second. When were the measures enacted, and what was that effect? Okay, so what we're going to do here, pull this up. That was my, okay. So let's look at when we did things and what happened afterwards. So Florida removes, can everybody can see that, hopefully? Yeah, okay, yeah. Great. So Florida removes restrictions. Fauci says that, Florida's asking for trouble. And then when we pit those restrictions being removed relative to other states, we do not see the same types of rise in cases. So we can go further. California versus Florida. California certainly closed indoor, outdoor dining, statewide curfews. I think they've banned outdoor dining. Again, numbers not commensurate to what we would think would happen in terms of, again, flattening the curve or stopping the spread. LA County, again, mask mandates, curfews, outdoor dining, things continue to escalate. There does not seem to be any marked effect. Ohio, same thing, mask mandates happen. Connecticut, fines for not wearing masks, and yet we still see these rises and falls that seem to be irrespective of the things that we're doing. We look at Minnesota, and this one's interesting. Minnesota had a shutdown order, but it occurred after the peak. But now they take credit for the fact that the shutdown was helping reduce cases, but it was already after a natural peak had occurred. Again, in Kentucky, same story.
Okay, so I think some of the points he's making here are fair, and they're things that you have to consider. What is the relationship between the mandates that we institute and the effect of the levels of coronavirus, or the specific numbers? There's a potential issue in that he's not considering that sometimes there's a lag, or just because something is implemented, it may take people a while to actually start doing that thing, or this other stuff. But he is fairly considering. I think these things are fair to consider. And then, yeah, so especially with that Minnesota, let's see. Yeah, I mean, and that can also be the case that it's just, I don't, okay, so Here's where I agree with him in that I don't think that they can definitively take credit for it, but I also don't think you can definitively say that um, there wasn't some relationship. Like some of this down here wasn't because of the mandate. He's saying it's because of a natural peak. I would be interested in how he defines natural peak at that point. Um, yeah, like how does he know that that's a quote unquote natural peak? If he does, then cool. I would say that he's right. But if he doesn't, if in fact he is just, to him, these mandates are out of control. I'm saying both are possibilities. The mandates are out of control, and oh, look at this. Here's that. That looks natural to me. Or there, we know that these things are natural, and so obviously this is a natural peak. Just labeling it a natural peak so it can support your argument, as opposed to understanding what a natural peak is and saying, see, this fits the definition of a natural peak, would be two different things.
Things that we're doing. We look at Minnesota, and this one's interesting. Minnesota had a shutdown order, but it occurred after the peak. But now they take credit for the fact that the shutdown was helping reduce cases, but it was already after a natural peak had occurred. Again, in Kentucky, same story. Up, continued restrictions. Okay, I'm going to move on because I know I'm going to run out of time here. So I want to kind of close off with some things. We've traded off $6.6 trillion of our money.
No, yeah. So, yeah, the other issue here is there's a difference between saying that it's like, again, I agree that this is fair to consider, but the way that he's going about this is fallacious. It is demonstrating a misunderstanding of reasoning. So, again, let me try to think of an example here. It's like, somebody says that wearing helmets, yeah, I mean, this is perfect. Somebody says that like wearing helmets is going to reduce your chances in like a vehicular wreck, or, wreck with some type of vehicle, of getting brain damage, right? And so sure enough, you get into a wreck and they check your brain and your brain is just really damaged, right? It's not a question of whether or not helmets help. It's very obviously scientifically established that they do. The question is, what was the severity of the crash, and how bad would it have been if you hadn't been wearing the helmet, right? So there's a huge problem in his reasoning here. He doesn't seem to understand that just because there was a mandate and the virus continued to go up does not mean that the mandate did not help. That is not what that means. Logically, you cannot come to that conclusion. You need more information. Again, it's fair for him to consider these things, but he's not considering them fairly. And those are two different things.
That was as of April 15th, so I'm sure we spent much more since then. We've given up cancer screenings. There are all sorts of metrics in regards to the economy, healthcare, crime. Suicides are up, domestic violence is up, arson is up, aggravated assault, burglaries. All these things are being cited as metrics related to the pandemic and lockdowns and economic despair. So I'll leave with this, and I know I'm out of time. What does this all mean? It means that when you take a terribly complex problem, such a brand new virus, and focus myopically on...
Yeah, and again, I think that that's fair. It's fair to consider all these other things that are up, and it's fair to consider what portion of this is likely due to the coronavirus. And then once we have those numbers, did the mandates essentially exacerbate more issues than they solved? Did they create more issues than they solved? That's completely fair. That may even be the case. I don't know that it's the case for sure, but to me, like, we're having a conversation along fair lines.
On a singular variable, take all the dials, turn them up to 11, and attempt to achieve victory in that one variable while simultaneously ignoring everything else, you do something incredibly stupid. COVID restriction.
Okay, so it's not one variable, but I will agree with him that it's much less. Like, we're considering fewer variables, from what I can tell, than the other side. We're not considering domestic violence. We're not considering suicide. We're not considering mental health issues, drug abuse, lots of other things, as opposed to really what boil down to, well, never mind. No, I can't say that, because while it's really hard to say, I guess, is the thing. I think it's all fair to consider, but it's hard to say. It's like you have to consider COVID deaths, but you also have to consider the impact of those COVID deaths on loved ones. You have to consider COVID harm. So not just whether or not you're going to die, but what are going to be your health issues for the rest of your life, and how much is that going to cost? How much of the resources on hospitals are going to be strained? How's that going to affect the economy and workforce with these people being hurt or killed by the coronavirus? There are actually multiple things to consider when it comes to the coronavirus in terms of its effects and the mitigating, the attempts to mitigate the harm that coronavirus directly causes itself, the virus. There's multiple things to consider on either one of those sides, on the side where it's directly causing harm and on the side where the mandates are causing harm. There are multiple things to consider. So yeah, I mean, again, I think it's fair to consider, he could, the bottom line, I think it's fair to consider. I'm not against him considering those things or other people considering those things. I think that's important.
Restrictions are stupid. You knew this. They tried to talk you out of it, but now you know. Again. Thank you.
I'm kind of interested in what he's going to say,
Jay.
so I'm just going to listen to a little bit of
Could
it.
go out of screen share. We'll go ahead.
Oh, yep.
Thank you.
Ah.
Perfect. Aaron, go ahead. The floor is yours.
Well, I just want to thank Jonah for being here, or Jay, and I'm excited about what Jay said here on the on his opening statements. So I believe obviously that we need to take these precautions seriously. I don't believe that these precautions are silly in any way, shape, or form. We should do our part to wear face masks. We should do our part to socially distance and reduce that curve. The CDC and our local and statewide mandates are for our best, for our health, and are to reduce the transmission, as Jay said, flatten the curve and to stop the spread. One came first, and then the other one. We need to do both. I think it's apparent that a second, third, or fourth wave is upon us, and for better or for worse, the U.S. we need to take COVID-19 very seriously. It's a serious threat. The curve was reduced in California. It was going down. However, much rhetoric has put doubt in the minds that this isn't more dangerous than common ailments like the cold or the flu, which are also caught through water droplets. I believe we need to reduce that curve, ensure that we give our hospitals the greatest amount of time prior to the development and through the development of pharmaceuticals, so that we can ensure that if there is a delay during the rollout, that we have the greatest chance of being able to support those that are getting the vaccination, those who will get the vaccination, and the rest of the people that could be saved by using those precautions and by not inundating those hospitals. We really need to reduce the death toll and the effects that many may live with for years to come after COVID-19. The evidence for this and the amount of research that's been done on this virus is acutely known over this past year or so. And a significant amount of research has been done. However, the after effects of COVID-19 are not widely known, and we need to take those into account when we're putting on our face masks, when we're keeping that 6-foot distance apart, when we are disciplining ourselves to not go to parties or go out and mingle or head over to that potluck and touch all of those utensils that people have touched before. We need to make sure that we're doing our best to protect them from ourselves, and we need to do it reasonably and responsibly. I'm not an expert. I don't have COVID-19, and I haven't had COVID-19, and I've been doing all these precautions. I've been making sure that I alcohol up before I touch, doorknobs and things like that. I do my best to wear my face mask, and there have been some close calls with regard to maybe some psychosomatic people being sick, but I've trained. I've been in some training, some environments where I've had to have interaction with people, and they implemented the COVID measures during those trainings, and they were kind of they seemed at the time, for probably some people in the training, that they had.
Okay, I just want to point out that right now I'm not hearing much of an argument. He's just saying that he thinks that the mandates and the suggestions of the CDC are needed, and that there are facts. So, I guess there is an argument there. There are facts, but he's not really being specific. He's not being nearly as specific as Aaron is, and maybe that would come out later on in the debate, but I'm not hearing him get into the specifics of how he knows or understands that these mandates did in fact mitigate harmful effects of coronavirus, and again on both sides, on the effects of the virus itself and the effects of versus the effects of the mandate.
They were overbearing. I mean, nobody likes to breathe through a face mask. Don't get me wrong. I'm not a big fan of breathing through a face mask, but no one in that course caught COVID, and I was with 17 other people there. It takes some discipline and some diligence, and I think that the lives.
Okay, so I think maybe he's saying, and would be an issue on his part. Again, he's not an expert too, so I've always been more interested in listening to experts on this, and I just get a way different impression when I listen to them than when I listen to people who aren't experts talk on it. The data seems convincing to me anyway, that the overall effects of the mandates or the suggestions are that there's less harm being caused. I think maybe, did he just say that he was in like a small group and nobody caught it? Because that would be somewhat cherry picking.
I do my best to wear my face mask, and there have been some close calls with regard to maybe some psychosomatic people being sick, but I've trained. I've been in some training, some environments where I've had to have interaction with people, and they implemented the COVID measures during those trainings, and they were kind of they seemed at the time, for probably some people in the training, that they had they were overbearing. I mean, nobody likes to breathe through a face mask. Don't get
right. Yeah, so he is saying that, and I would say that's not enough to conclude that in totality, the mandates and the suggestions did lessen harm. The fact that he went to training and there were policies in place and nobody got sick, therefore those policies did in fact stop them from getting it. You would really want to do some type of study where perhaps COVID is in fact in the room, or which, by the way, they have done and there are studies of. But him going through that one thing is not sufficient evidence that it does mitigate. Certainly not evidence that it's less harmful, that the mandates are less harmful than not having those mandates.
Don't get me wrong, I'm not a big fan of breathing through a face mask, but no one in that course caught COVID, and I was with 17 other people there. It takes some discipline and some diligence, and I think that the lives of our friends, our loved ones, those with comorbidities, I'm not gonna dazzle you with statistics, but I believe we need to think about those around us and think about our nurses and our doctors in the hospitals, and do everything we can to reduce the spread while this vaccine gets rolled out. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much.
Yeah, okay. So I think in totality, I think the brief did much better at giving certain facts, understanding the kind of major points of the conversation and coming to a conclusion on this topic. I think the brief did much better. He also exhibited way more issues in reasoning or fallacies, but that's probably because like Aaron didn't actually do that much. So that's a huge issue there for me. Again, my position is still, there is plenty of information. You can listen to virologists. You can go on Reddit and talk to virologists. They have podcasts. They have Facebook pages. They have YouTube channels, and you can just go listen to them for days and days. And virologists and epidemiologists and medical professionals of all types. And listening to them, it was very clear that the data that they were giving absolutely demonstrated that what we knew about the virus and what we knew about wearing masks and about social distancing and about reducing your exposure to public places was absolutely going to reduce the amount of deaths and harm, even to some degree. And again, we still need the numbers here, but we don't have the numbers, so that's the important bit. The amount of people who committed suicide, right? And I think I talked about this before, and I'll kind of end on this, was we had an increase at the end of the year in terms of the amount of people who had died on average in any given year. And the idea is that a certain amount of those were from underreported COVID deaths. It's also likely the case that certain amounts of those are going to be from homicide because people were inside, they were stuck in a house together, or because of that domestic abuse is going to cause harm. There's a certain amount of harm that was let's just stick with deaths. There was a certain amount of homicide that occurred. There was a certain amount of suicide that occurred because of social isolation, because of people being at home for longer periods of time with one another. There is no reason at this point to think that outweighed the amount of deaths that would have very likely occurred had we not socially distanced, had we not wore masks. I don't like the framing of this as silly or not silly. I'm starting to see why they framed it as silly or not silly. But I think just, did it or did it not reduce the amount of harm? And when I hear experts speak, it seems to me that it quite obviously did. Again, I'm listening to the brief, and I'm hearing, again, that just the idea that the amount of, the number of people were wearing masks, so there was this mandate and the numbers went up, does not at all tell us whether or not they would have went up even more if people didn't wear masks. That's a different type of situation. So if the fact that he's not seeing things like that are a bad sign to me. I don't think Aaron is the best person to be having this conversation. that's another thing that I always find it interesting when people who oppose the scientific or academic narrative very rarely actually talk to a scientist or an academic who disagrees with them. That's another reason that I tend to side with academics and scientists, is because I notice that when there is a disagreement, they want to talk to people who obviously aren't going to be, they don't do it for a living. They talk to people who don't deal with facts around that issue for a living. And I think that says a lot too. But all right, that's what I got for today.